But just as PC culture engulfed the town of South Park in just a single season, a lot changed in the 3 years between the original South Park, The Stick of Truth, and its sequel. I'm your host, Jet Set with the Leaderboard, and this is South Park, The Stick of Truth versus The Fractured But Whole. Remember to subscribe and click the bell icon to become part of the notification squad. Before we get into the individual developers behind both titles, we're going to quickly call out one creative consistency that contributed to the success of these games. Typically, when a developer adapts a popular property like, say, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, more often than not, the creative force behind the series, in this case Steven Spielberg, is not involved in the game's development. This lack of creative input often makes franchise games feel more or less like half-assed cash grabs. Fortunately for South Park fans, series creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone are gamers at heart and wanted to see a South Park game that could be more than South Park 64. To avoid a similar train wreck, they became more involved in the development process than most creators, not only contributing to the game's writing, but providing their own input on gameplay and design. They were pretty much creating a game that they would want to buy. The first developer they collaborated with on The Stick of Truth was a studio that gave RPG fanatics a warm, tingly feeling, and for good reason. Obsidian Entertainment has worked on some of the finest RPGs released in modern gaming, from Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2 to Fallout New Vegas. In fact, that's precisely why Stone and Parker themselves decided on the studio. Obsidian's time spent developing pre-existing properties as opposed to their own had granted them chameleon-like capabilities, allowing the studio to create a Fallout game with Bethesda-like charm. With South Park, the team outdid themselves, creating not just a game, but something akin to a fully interactive season of the South Park TV show, successfully replicating everything from the show's art style, animation, to its affinity for fart jokes. But for all their talent, Obsidian still had to overcome several hardships beyond their control. The biggest one being the loss of their publisher, THQ, who filed for bankruptcy during the Stick of Truth's development. Without a publisher to fund the game, Stick of Truth was pretty much a pipe dream for YouTubers to speculate about and romanticize. Fortunately, Ubisoft obtained the Stick of Truth through an auction of THQ's assets. This acquisition not only saved the Stick of Truth, but it also set the stage for the next developer to take on the Fractured But Whole. Instead of reaching out for help from a third-party developer like Obsidian, Ubisoft decided it best to assign the sequel to one of their own studios, Ubisoft San Francisco. Unlike Obsidian Entertainment, Ubisoft San Francisco did not have a rich and organic history filled with highly successful titles recognized by the gaming majority. Established in 2009, Ubisoft San Fran had but 2 games to their name, Rocksmith and Rocksmith 2014. These games were pretty much Ubisoft's answer to Guitar Hero, the main difference being that if you were good at Rocksmith, it meant that you were probably actually good at playing a real guitar. So unlike Obsidian, RPGs were uncharted territory. To make things a tad more difficult, Ubisoft San Fran had a little less than 3 years to develop the sequel, while Obsidian had been working on their 2014 release since 2009. So how did the new kids fare against all the odds? It's no secret that South Park is a favorite show to many, tackling every corner of pop culture since its debut in 1997, from Pokemon to Game of Thrones. Like a full episode, these South Park RPGs take on a television show's distinct pop cultural theme. A quick glance at the Stick of Truth's box art tells you right off the bat that it's a love letter and crude middle finger to the genre most associated with RPGs, fantasy. It's a specific type of game Matt and Trey have both embraced since childhood. In fact, the Wizard King costume Cartman wears throughout the game reflects a nearly identical Gandalf-like outfit he wore in the Season 6 episode, The Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers. This episode was mostly a parody of J.R.R. Tolkien's go-to fantasy story, The Lord of the Rings saga. In fact, the Stick of Truth story is more than just similar to Tolkien's tale, it plays upon the One Ring trope, an artifact whose power can be harnessed to rule the earth. Trey Parker even initially pitched the game to Obsidian as South Park meets Skyrim. The decision to make the game's customizable protagonist, the new kid, the strong silent type, is also in direct reference to the granddaddy of all fantasy video games, The Legend of Zelda, in which the series protagonist, Link, is known to never speak. Unless, of course, CDI Phillips is canon. Golly! The character classes players can choose from are also no different than those found in Dungeons & Dragons. There's the mage, who deals in the magical attacks, but in the context of South Park, it's essentially toy lightsabers, fire extinguishers, and blowtorches. There's also the fighter class, which is South Park's equivalent of the fantasy genre warrior class, which traditionally dabbles in combat with swords not made from cardboard. More commonly referred to as the rogue in Dungeons & Dragons, the thief class specializes in stealth and dexterity, while the Jew class was never a class than any fantasy RPG ever. It's not an entirely original South Park creation, aside from the fact that it's a jab at an entire people. The Jew is a hybrid of the traditional fantasy classes known as the Monk and Paladin, and is known for being more of a high-risk, high-reward type. If you prefer a hero whose armor does more than shine, the Fractured but Whole may be more of an investment. It's a bit more on the nose than its fantasy counterpart. Instead, it serves more as a commentary on the current Hollywood landscape, more specifically its unhealthy obsession with the superhero cinematic universes. The story revolves around the South Park kids' superhero personas from the show, aka Coon and Friends, trying to launch a cinematic world with all of their personas in the same playing field. The unfortunate reality is that not everyone can be the Iron Man of a franchise. Due to the overwhelming amount of heroes, and Cartman's ego, there are those that are doomed to the fate of Daredevil and Jessica Jones, confined to the obscurity of a Netflix series. This conflict causes a civil war of Captain America-sized proportions and results in an additional group of kids known as the Freedom Pals. They set out to create their own superior cinematic universe, not unlike the current cinematic arms race between Marvel Studios and DC Films. Hollywood politics aside, the game is still very much a tribute and mockery to comic books as a whole, with every detail, down to the tragic backstory that inspires the protagonist to be the hero that they are. The character classes are based on superhero archetypes. For example, if characters like the Flash and Quicksilver are more your speed, you probably press the A button the moment you saw the Speedster class. If you're down to smash like Hulk or the Thing, go all out with Brutalist. If you like getting inside your enemy's head, or just want an excuse to impersonate Sir Patrick Stewart, look no further than the Professor X class, Psychic. There are plenty more classes that cater to various playstyles and your favorite real-world heroes, even if that real-world hero is Halle Berry's Razzie Award-winning Catwoman. Now, fans may argue that the humor in the Fractured but Whole will quickly become dated due to its timely subject matter, whereas Stick of Truth's theme is timeless. The fantasy genre has remained a prominent force since the late 1800s. Only time will tell which game will become a classic. While it's true that Stick of Truth and Fractured but Whole are both RPGs, they are two different breeds that offer two very different experiences. Stick of Truth takes on the more traditional RPG gameplay most players think of for the genre, and that's turn-based RPG. You know, the one where the good guys and bad guys hate each other with a burning passion, yet have the politeness to allow their opponent the chance to strike them so long as they've waited their turn fair and square. While we've stated earlier that Skyrim was a significant influence on the game's design, some games served as a more prominent influence for more obvious reasons. For instance, the Paper Mario series, which is not only a turn-based RPG, but one that successfully blends 2D graphics with 3D and Z-axis. Another significant influence came from one of Nintendo's more obscure titles, Earthbound. Earthbound was obviously influential through its turn-based combat, but according to Parker, the overall aesthetic of the game was a big inspiration for the game's aesthetics. After all, the game follows Ness, a 13-year-old boy, who not only fights his foes with psychic abilities, but with everyday objects like baseball bats and yo-yos. This element has been replicated in the fighting styles of the children of South Park, albeit more realistic. Or fake? I mean, they use blowtorches instead of magical fire, and ketchup packets instead of real blood. Fractured but Whole aimed for a different approach with its core design philosophy. It's still the turn-based combat we all know and love, but with some extra dimensions. The battlefield contains a grid that players can move freely through to better position themselves for a strategic advantage. But forewarning you, no one is special. Enemies can position themselves just as players can. On a more exciting note, surprises are littered throughout the grid battlegrounds, and by surprises we mean environmental hazards that can mess you up if you're not careful. But hey, they can also screw over your foes as well. Different attacks have different ranges and effects on the grid. Depending on where players place their character, they can dodge attacks, or even perform moves that will knock enemies into one another or an ally. In other words, you can gain an edge in battle if you learn proper socio-political etiquette from new fan-favorite character, PC Principal, who can teach you how to properly identify microaggressions from your foes during battle. Identifying microaggressions will grant the player a free in-battle attack. Neat! Since its debut in 1997, South Park has made a name for itself by pushing the envelope of what they can put on television. And with the release of Stick of Truth, it's now challenging video games in the same way. Much like Comedy Central's reluctance to allow Matt and Trey to feature certain specific religious figures on the show, the game lost some of its battles when it came to its controversial sense of humor, at least outside the United States. Oddly enough, Ubisoft censored up to 7 scenes themselves as opposed to giving in to censors, citing the choice as a market decision. In other words, they wanted to make sure they could make as much money as possible by appeasing the sensitivities of other countries. Censored scenes include the alien anal probe sequence and the stage in which the player can perform an abortion. The German version of the game was unique in that it had all allusions to Nazi zombies and Hitler removed because Germany has banned Nazi symbols. Australia's classification board initially refused to rate the game due to its sexual violence, namely because it's associated with children. If you follow Matt and Trey, you know they don't take censorship lightly, and they didn't quite let Ubisoft off the hook without publicly humiliating them for their censorship compliance. Thus, the duo demanded that they be allowed to insert slides featuring humorous images of crying statues and koala bears that apologize to foreign players and describe what they're missing out on, thus simultaneously mocking Ubisoft and its censors for being killjoys. The attempts at censorship were rendered moot by PC players, as modders created patches that did away with the slides and presented the game as it was meant to be played. Surprisingly, the Fractured But Whole features humor far more offensive and grotesque than its predecessor, yet Ubisoft released the game utterly uncensored in all territories, as was intended by Matt and Trey. However, this did not mean the game dodged backlash from critics. One particularly controversial feature was the Fractured But Whole's unique difficulty settings. Whereas most games have you select your difficulty from an options menu, the Fractured But Whole determines the difficulty level through the customization of the new kid's skin color. A character with lighter skin will get higher pay for completed tasks and more favorable and friendly behavior from NPCs. Making your character's skin darker makes for a more challenging experience, with dark-skinned characters earning less money and dealing with rude NPCs. The backlash wasn't nearly loud enough to pressure Ubisoft to change this part of the game, probably because South Park had been around for 20 years and people know that, while jokes come across as harsh, they open a dialogue about real-world issues. I mean, how many times has Kyle learned something today? Thank you for watching The Stick of Truth versus The Fractured But Whole. Which one is your favorite game? Comment below and let us know. Hit that bell icon to become part of the notification squad, and if you like getting more from your games, subscribe to the Leaderboard, your home for video game facts.